Meet Margaret Williams, a 71-year-old widow living in the quiet suburbs of Springfield, Illinois. For more than 3 decades, she poured her heart into raising her children and working tirelessly to build the one thing she could truly call her own, her home. Now, in the autumn of her life, Margaret finds herself at a crossroads. When her adult son arrives with plans to move his entire family into her house without asking, she faces not only a fight for her space, but also a deeper struggle for respect, dignity, and independence. This is more than one woman's story. It reflects the hidden battles of countless older adults who are too often overlooked, dismissed, or pressured to sacrifice their happiness for others. Through Margaret's journey, we shine a light on courage, boundaries, and the right to live freely, even in later years. Welcome to Grandma's Final Chapter, a channel dedicated to powerful, emotional storytelling that honors the wisdom of older generations. Here, every video is crafted to inspire reflection, healing, and connection across families and communities. If you believe seniors deserve happiness and self-determination, make sure to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Join us daily for meaningful stories that remind us all it is never too late to choose yourself. The house had learned her footsteps. In the quiet of early morning, the maple in the front yard scraped a soft rhythm against the siding, and the kitchen clock clicked like a gentle heartbeat. Margaret Williams moved through these sounds the way a person moves through prayer. She set the kettle on, folded the dish towel along its faded crease, and traced the hairline crack that ran across the counter. 35 years in the same suburban home had turned small imperfections into scripture. She knew which stair sighed under weight. She knew where the afternoon sun would fall on the dining table, a bright square that used to be the landing strip for spelling tests and soccer cleats and dripping popsicles. 71 did not feel fragile. It felt seasoned. It felt like the cool weight of the wedding band that now lived in a velvet box in the bedroom drawer, a circle she still touched when the house grew too quiet. Widowhood had taught her to negotiate silence. She filled it with morning walks, with a paperback left open on the arm of the chair, with phone calls to friends who spoke of gardens and arthritic knees and discount days at the pharmacy. She had raised 3 children into their own orbits. She had balanced budgets, survived layoffs at the library, and paid off a mortgage one careful check at a time. The kettle began to whisper. Margaret poured hot water over grounds and listened to the bloom rise in the filter. Coffee was a small ceremony that asked nothing of her except attention. She cupped the mug and turned toward the kitchen window. The backyard waited, trimmed and ordinary, a square of grass bordered by a low fence. The ordinary steadied her. It always had. David did not knock. The door gave its familiar hinge groan, and a moment later his shoes crossed the hallway tile. He had his father's height and none of his patience. Even the air seemed to tighten around him, like fabric stretched over a fist. "Mom, I will make this quick," he said, as if he were already late for the next thing. "This week, Linda and I are moving in. The kids too, and Linda's mother. Their apartment is a mess. It is too tight. We need space. We have decided. No discussion." The sentence landed the way a storm front lands, without apology. Margaret felt the heat of the mug move through the thin porcelain and into her palms. She did not speak. She watched his mouth shape certainty. She watched his eyes rake the room like an assessor, not a son. He moved to the living room and stood as if he were trying on the place. "We can put the sofa bed against this wall. The sewing room works for Leo and Sophie. Mom, you will like the company. You should not be here alone at your age." At your age. 2 short words arranged like a gate. Margaret tasted something metallic at the back of her throat. This was not the first time he had said it. He said it when she carried groceries herself. He said it when she refused to sell the car and switched to ride shares. He dressed his doubts in the language of concern, and most days she let the small cuts heal without remark. Today, the skin did not close so easily. She set the mug down. The cup rattled against the saucer, a tiny drumbeat that betrayed the tremor in her hand. David heard it and smiled in a way that made her feel like a minor problem already solved. "David," she said, and the sound of his name steadied her. "This is my house." He gave a short laugh. Not cruel, not loud, simply careless. Of course it is, Mom, but it has 3 bedrooms and you are one person. We will figure out the bills. It is temporary, until we find something bigger. Temporary. She remembered temporary, that elastic word that snapped back and left a mark. Temporary had turned into years when his sister lost her job and slept on this same sofa. Temporary had become tradition when the holidays stretched into January because no one wanted to leave. Margaret saw him moving the furniture in his head, aligning his needs with her rooms, and she understood that her wishes had not been part of his math. She looked past him to the hallway where the height marks still lived on the trim, faint pencil lines with names and dates written in her neat hand. David at 8, thrilled to catch up to his brother. Emily at 11, a slash nearly as tall as her mother. These were the artifacts of a life made by saying yes. Yes to overtime. Yes to secondhand prom dresses. Yes to bologna sandwiches that stretched until Friday. Yes to a boy who grew into a man who now used the word temporary like a key. "You should have called," she said. Her voice was quiet, the way the river is quiet before it finds a rapid. "You should have asked." "There was no time to debate," he replied. "Linda's mother cannot be alone anymore. The kids are excited. They need space to play. You will love it. You are lonely here. Everyone says it is not safe for a woman your age to live alone." Lonely, unsafe. At your age. The words stacked inside her like boxes she had not agreed to carry. She thought of Helen from the yoga group, of the way they laughed about people who spoke to them as if they were already fading from the edges. She thought of all the mornings she had woken early by choice, not by need, because the light was best then, and the birds argued in the maple, and she liked to be first to claim the day. She did not feel like a fragile thing. She felt like a person who had learned to bend in the wind and still keep her roots. "When do you plan to bring everyone?" she asked. The question felt strange in her mouth, like a line delivered by an actress who has decided to change the ending. "Saturday," he said. He began to list logistics. Boxes, a truck, a friend with a dolly. He paced while he spoke, and every step drew a chalk outline around her choices. Margaret picked up the mug again. The coffee had cooled. She held it anyway, kneading the shape in her hands. She lifted her eyes to her son. She studied the jaw that clenched when he thought he was right. She remembered the night he was born. She remembered the heat of his small body against her chest, the untidy love that reorders a life in a single hour. Love, she knew, had little to do with obedience. Love included the word no. Something lit behind her eyes, not anger, not grief. It was smaller and stronger, like a flint spark in dry tinder. She felt her spine lengthen. She heard her own breath settle. The room came into a new focus, the way it does when a storm rolls past and the world looks scrubbed clean. "All right," she said, and David stopped pacing. He mistook the calm for surrender. He relaxed, satisfied, and reached to kiss her forehead. The kiss was light and patronizing. A pat on the head given to a woman who would comply, the same woman she had been each time he pushed the edge of her patience and found no wall. He left with the energy of a victor, his plans tucked under his arm like a folded map. The door closed. The house exhaled. Margaret stood very still and listened to the maple outside drag its fingertips across the siding. She lifted the mug and took a final sip of coffee that had turned bitter. Then she set the cup in the sink and washed it clean. She dried her hands on the dish towel, folded it along the same old crease, and reached for the phone on the wall. Helen would be awake by now. The first ring was a metronome. The second ring sounded like a starting bell. By the third, the spark in her eyes had become a line of quiet fire, thin and bright, running straight through the center of her. Margaret stood in the living room with her coffee cooling in her hand, watching David pace as if the house already belonged to him. He opened closet doors, glanced at the guest room, even measured the sewing table with his eyes as though calculating where a bunk bed could fit. The familiarity of his movements pierced her like a splinter. He was not looking at keepsakes. He was not seeing the walls she had painted, the carpet she had saved months to afford, or the books that had followed her from the library shelves into retirement. He was surveying territory, not honoring a home. For a moment, her mind fled backward. She remembered late nights in the library, stamping books with ink that never seemed to wash off her fingers. She remembered clipping coupons, skipping restaurant meals, and carrying peanut butter sandwiches in wax paper so that the mortgage could be met. 40 years of careful choices. 40 years of saying no to herself so that her children could grow up in stability. She had balanced every paycheck against overdue notices and walked away each time, still holding on to this house. It was not charity. It was survival, purchased inch by inch. David turned, his smile stretched thin. "Mom, you are 71. Living here alone is dangerous. If you fell, no one would even know. This is better for everyone." The words slid into the room with a practiced ease, but the cut was sharp. Dangerous. Alone. At her age, she felt her spine harden under the weight of his dismissal. It was not fear he stirred, but defiance. Did he not see that she still walked each morning in the park, still read novels without glasses, still paid every bill on time? Did he not understand that age was not the same as weakness? Her jaw tightened. The house seemed to echo his laughter, a hollow sound that reduced her to a shadow in her own space. He thought she should be grateful for the noise of children, for the supervision of his wife, for the presence of another old woman to keep her company. He believed she was merely a placeholder, someone occupying square footage until a younger family arrived to fill it properly. She set the cup on the table and looked at him. In her silence was a storm-gathering force. This was not just about a house. It was about the right to be recognized as whole, capable, and deserving of respect. Across America, she knew, older women like her were told in countless subtle ways that they were finished, that their independence was an illusion, that their choices no longer mattered. She had listened to friends at the yoga group confess that their grown children tried to take their car keys, their bank cards, even their decision of where to live. Each story sounded like a lock clicking shut. David spoke again, softer, but with the same edge of certainty. "You will see, Mom. It will be good for you." Margaret breathed slowly, steadying the tremor in her hand. His words had struck at her pride, but in the sting she felt something else rise. She was not a guest here, she was not a fragile relic. This house had her name on the deed, her sweat in the beams, her laughter in the walls. She had earned every square foot, and no careless remark could erase that. She did not argue, not yet. She let the silence sit heavy between them, a silence that carried the weight of 4 decades of sacrifice. Inside that silence, she made a private vow. This time she would not be overlooked. This time she would not surrender the life she had built to anyone's convenience. Margaret let the phone rest in her palm for a long moment before dialing. The familiar buttons glowed faintly, waiting, as if the machine itself knew what she was about to confess. She pressed the numbers with careful precision, listening to the ringing that cut through the quiet of the kitchen. Each chime felt like a step closer to admitting the storm inside her. On the 4th ring, a voice answered, warm and textured by years of friendship. "Margaret, is everything all right?" It was Helen, her oldest ally. They had met 3 summers ago in the community yoga class at Lincoln Park, both women drawn more by the companionship than the stretching. Helen, with her quick laugh and silver hair cropped short, had the rare ability to listen without judgment. To Margaret, that was a gift more valuable than any advice. "I need to see you," Margaret said. Her voice carried a tremor that surprised even her. "Tomorrow morning, if you can." "Of course. Come by after our walk." "Or I'll come to you. What's going on?" Margaret hesitated. She felt the words press against her throat like water rising behind a dam. At last, she let them spill. "David came this morning. He told me his whole family is moving into my house. No discussion, just decided." There was silence on the line, then a sharp intake of breath. "Your house? He told you that?" "Yes," Margaret whispered. "As if I had no say. As if the walls I paid for were already his." Helen's voice turned firm. We need to talk in person. This is not something you should carry alone." When Margaret hung up, she felt lighter, though nothing had changed. It was the relief of knowing someone else would help her shoulder the weight. The next morning, the sky opened wide and clean, the kind of Midwestern blue that made the maple leaves shimmer. Margaret tied her sneakers, slipped into her pink tracksuit, and met Helen at the corner where the walking group usually gathered. Today, though, they didn't join the others. They branched off, choosing a quieter path lined with sycamores that whispered overhead. Helen walked briskly, her cane tapping rhythmically, though she hardly needed it. "Tell me everything," she said. Margaret recounted it all: the unannounced arrival, the careless laughter, the word temporary stretched thin like an old rubber band. Helen listened, eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a firm line. When Margaret finished, they stopped at a bench overlooking the small lake. Ducks glided across the water, unbothered by human troubles. Helen turned to her with a clarity that sliced through the morning air. "Margaret, listen to me. We are not born to become guests in our own homes. We spend decades raising families, working jobs that grind us down, pinching pennies just to hold on to something that is ours. That house is yours, not theirs. If they try to invade your space, you must resist. You must." The word struck Margaret like a bell. Clear, uncompromising, true. She felt the spark inside her grow, feeding on the conviction of her friend. "But Helen," she whispered, "he's my son." Helen placed a hand over hers. "And you are his mother, not his servant. Do not confuse the two. Loving your children does not mean surrendering your dignity." Margaret's throat tightened. She remembered every shift at the library, every night she skipped new shoes so she could make an extra payment. She had built that house brick by brick with her own sacrifices. Why should she now shrink to the corner while others claimed it? Helen straightened her shoulders. "If he moves in, he will never leave. You know this. And you will vanish inside your own life. Do not let it happen." The ducks scattered as a breeze rolled across the water. Margaret felt the truth of Helen's warning settle deep in her chest. She had always been the one to bend, to accommodate, to keep the peace. But what had peace given her except exhaustion? She turned to her friend, eyes sharp. "Then I will not let it happen." For the first time since David's announcement, Margaret felt the word no form fully on her tongue, solid, heavy, unshakable. They walked back slowly, talking through what steps might come next. Not yet a plan, but the outline of one. Margaret would gather her documents, make sure the deed was in order. She would prepare herself for the storm that would surely come when David realized his mother was no longer yielding. At the corner, Helen squeezed her hand. "Remember this, Margaret. Your worth does not expire. Your years do not make you fragile. They make you strong." As Margaret walked the final block alone, she replayed those words. Strength. Worth. Not a guest. Not an afterthought. She was the woman who had built a life from nothing. She was the woman who had more resilience in her bones than her son could yet imagine. When she entered her kitchen again, the clock ticked steadily, as if keeping watch. Margaret poured herself another cup of coffee. The steam curled upward, carrying with it the vow she had silently made. If you have ever seen parents pressured into choices they did not want, if you have ever watched elders treated as burdens instead of treasures, write "agree" in the comments below. Let them see they are not alone. Let them know their voices still matter. Linda arrived on a Thursday morning, the kind of morning when the light slipped softly through the curtains and the house smelled of cinnamon from the oatmeal Margaret had just finished. Margaret noticed the sound of a car door closing, then the quick steps of heels on her walkway. She glanced through the window and saw her daughter-in-law balancing a white bakery box tied with string, her smile already prepared before she even rang the bell. Margaret opened the door, heart steady but cautious. Linda leaned in with a practiced warmth. "Good morning, Mom. I brought you some fresh pastries, your favorite apple Danish." The box looked harmless enough, but Margaret felt the weight of its intention. Gifts had always been Linda's way of softening the ground before planting something unwanted. She accepted the box politely, setting it on the counter, and gestured toward the dining table. They sat across from each other, the table between them suddenly feeling like a courtroom bench. Linda's hands fidgeted with the string from the box. She cleared her throat, her tone light but edged with something more calculated. "David told you, didn't he, about us moving in for a while? It's really the best thing for everyone. You won't be so alone anymore. Having company is good at your age." The words stung, though Margaret had expected them. Alone, at your age, they were weapons dressed in kindness. She folded her hands, keeping her face unreadable. Linda leaned forward as if her enthusiasm could sweep away objections. "The kids are so excited, Mom. Sophie already picked out which corner she wants for her little desk in your sewing room. Leo keeps asking when he can bring his posters. They'll bring so much joy to the house." Margaret's breath caught at the mention of her sewing room, her private sanctuary filled with fabrics and patterns, the quiet space where her hands found peace. The thought of crayons scattered across her fabric scissors or juice boxes left on her machine made her chest tighten. She let Linda continue, listening as her daughter-in-law painted a picture of cheerful mornings and happy children running through hallways. But beneath the bright strokes, Margaret heard the truth. This was not about companionship. It was about convenience, about shifting burdens onto her shoulders because she had space and they did not. Finally, Margaret raised her eyes, steady and unflinching. "Linda, may I ask you something?" Her daughter-in-law blinked, still smiling. "Of course, Mom." "Did anyone ask me if I wanted this?" The question landed like a dropped plate, shattering the rhythm of the conversation. Linda's mouth opened, then closed. Her fingers tightened around the napkin on the table. For the first time since she had walked in, her confidence faltered. "Well," she stammered, "David said, he said you were happy about it, that you thought it would be nice to have us here. We assumed." Margaret leaned back in her chair, her voice calm but carrying the edge of steel that had been buried too long. "Assumed. That is the word, isn't it? Assumed I would surrender my home, my space, my peace without even being asked." Linda flushed, shifting in her seat. She tried to recover, reaching for sympathy. "But Mom, we're family. We only want what's best for you. You shouldn't have to eat alone or spend evenings by yourself. Think of the children, how close they'll be to you." "Think of me," Margaret interrupted, her tone sharper now. "Think of whether I want my solitude replaced with chaos. Think of whether I want my sewing room stripped of what gives me joy. Did you consider that?" The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Linda's eyes darted to the pastry box as if it might rescue her, but the sweetness no longer masked the bitterness of her intentions. Margaret held her gaze, refusing to shrink back. For years she had softened her words, swallowed her protests, tried to keep harmony at the cost of her own needs. Not this time. The table no longer felt like a courtroom. It felt like a battlefield, and for once she was not retreating. Linda finally looked down, twisting the napkin until it tore in her hands. Her voice was quieter now, almost defensive. We thought it would work out. "We didn't mean to upset you." "You didn't mean to ask me either," Margaret replied. The firmness in her voice startled even herself, but it felt right. It felt overdue. For a long moment they sat without speaking. Margaret could feel the balance of power shifting across the table, subtle but undeniable. Linda had entered with pastries and assumptions, certain of victory. She left with uncertainty clouding her smile, her plans suddenly less secure. When the door finally closed behind her, Margaret stood in the quiet of her home, the box of pastries untouched on the counter. She drew a deep breath and felt the echo of her own words strengthen her spine. For the first time in years, she had held her ground, and in that silence, she knew this was only the beginning. The following Saturday came with a restless wind that rattled the branches of the maple tree outside. Margaret had just finished watering the small geraniums on the porch when she saw David's car swing sharply into the driveway. The slam of his door carried the kind of fury she recognized from his teenage years when he would storm inside after losing a basketball game. But this was not a boy's sulk. This was a grown man's anger, heavy with entitlement. He did not bother with pleasantries. He marched straight through the front door, his voice rising before his shoes had even crossed the rug. "Mom, what did you say to Linda? She came home crying. She told me you don't want us here. After everything we planned, after we gave up our lease, you're going to back out now?" Margaret stood still, letting his words pound against her like waves against a seawall. She had expected this. She had rehearsed her strength in the mirror, had reminded herself that resistance was not cruelty, it was self-respect. "David," she said evenly, "you never asked me in the first place. You told me what would happen as if my opinion didn't exist." He threw his arms up. "I cannot believe this. You live alone in a 3-bedroom house and you won't even help your own family. Do you know how selfish that sounds?" The word landed like a dart. Selfish. It had always been his sharpest blade, the one designed to cut through her guilt. As a child, he had used it when he wanted an extra toy, as a teenager when he wanted the car, as an adult when money ran thin. Now he wielded it again, expecting her to fold. Margaret felt her pulse quicken, but she held her ground. She drew a breath, deep and slow, then spoke with clarity that filled the room. "Selfish is not protecting the home I worked 40 years to pay for. Selfish is treating my home as the solution to your failures." David's face froze, as if he had not understood. Then his mouth opened, but no sound came. For the first time in years, her son, who always had an answer, always a retort, was silent. The silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. Margaret could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock, the steady rhythm of her own breath. In that stillness, she realized the power had shifted. David finally found his voice, though it was thinner, less certain. "You don't mean that. You can't." "I do," Margaret replied. Her hands no longer trembled. "I raised you, David. I gave everything I had so you could stand on your own 2 feet. That was my job as your mother. But it was never my job to hand over my life when you stumbled. This house is not your safety net. It is my home." His jaw tightened. He paced, searching for another angle. "What will people say if you turn your back on your family? What will the neighbors think, knowing you left your son and grandchildren with nowhere to go?" "What people think," Margaret said quietly, "is not worth more than my dignity. If you wanted to protect your children, you should have made better choices before announcing plans that were never yours to make." Her words hit him harder than she expected. He stopped pacing, his shoulders slumped. For a brief second, she saw the boy he had once been lost, vulnerable, still wanting his mother to clean up after his mistakes. But Margaret knew if she softened now, everything would collapse. "Mom," he whispered, "how can you do this to us?" She lifted her chin. "No, David. How could you do this to me?" The red line had been drawn, clear and permanent. For the first time in her life, Margaret had claimed her place without apology. David's silence was not victory, but it was proof that her voice had power, and she knew she would never let it be silenced again. The morning after her confrontation with David, Margaret woke before dawn. She sat at the edge of her bed, the old quilt pulled around her knees, staring at the dim outline of her dresser. Sleep had barely touched her, yet she felt strangely alert, her mind restless with possibility. For decades, she had responded to life by accommodating others, by folding herself smaller so those around her could fit more comfortably. Now she could sense the shape of a different answer forming inside her. It frightened her. It thrilled her. At 7 sharp, Helen arrived. She wore her navy cardigan, her cane tucked under her arm more as an accessory than a necessity. "Ready?" she asked, eyes glinting with the excitement of a co-conspirator. Margaret slipped her purse over her shoulder. "More ready than I've ever been." They drove in silence at first, the hum of Helen's sedan steady on the road toward downtown Springfield. Margaret kept her hands clasped in her lap, trying to still the tremor in her fingers. This wasn't a casual errand. It was a line crossed, a decision that could not be reversed once she stepped through the glass doors of the bank. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish. A young teller with bright lipstick greeted them, But it was the branch manager, a man with salt and pepper hair and a voice like gravel, who guided Margaret to a private office. He addressed her formally. "Mrs. Williams, what can we do for you today?" Margaret sat upright, folding her hands on the desk. "I'd like to access my savings account, the one under my name only." The manager nodded, typing swiftly. "Of course, you've maintained it for many years. A tidy sum." Margaret felt the weight of his words. That tidy sum represented years of sewing side jobs, skipped vacations, and every library overtime shift she had volunteered for. It was her safety, her independence, her silent rebellion against dependence on anyone else. Today, it would become something more, her escape route. "I'd like to arrange a transfer," she said firmly. "A large one." Helen sat beside her, quiet but steady, her hand resting lightly on Margaret's arm. The papers slid across the desk, numbers printed neatly in rows. Margaret signed each page, her pen strokes slow but unwavering. With every signature she felt stronger, as if reclaiming pieces of herself long buried under compromise. When it was finished, the manager looked up. "Are you certain, Mrs. Williams? It's a significant amount." Margaret met his eyes. "I am certain. It's my money, my decision." The words tasted powerful. Their second stop was a modest office on the edge of town, a real estate agency tucked between a cafe and a hardware store. The agent, Mr. Patterson, had been working with Margaret quietly for weeks, ever since David first hinted that her house was too big for her. "Mrs. Williams," he greeted her warmly, "I believe we're ready." The property near Lake Michigan, you'll find it cozy, perfect for one person, with just enough space for visitors when you choose. Margaret followed him into the office, where stacks of contracts waited. Photographs of the little cottage were spread across the desk, white siding, a porch swing, and a patch of garden glowing in late afternoon sun. It was smaller than her current house, but it radiated something she hadn't felt in years. Freedom. Helen studied the pictures with admiration. "It looks peaceful, Margaret, and it looks like it's yours." The agent slid the final document forward. "All we need is your signature." Margaret picked up the pen. Her hand paused above the line. She thought of David's face, red with anger, calling her selfish. She thought of Linda, smiling as she described where her children would place their desks and toys, as if Margaret's sanctuary were already theirs. She thought of the word temporary, the word assumption, the word alone. Then she pressed the pen down, the ink flowing across the page in neat letters. Margaret Williams. It was done. When they stepped back into the afternoon light, Margaret felt the air different in her lungs, lighter, cleaner. Helen looked at her with a smile both proud and mischievous. "How do you feel?" Margaret laughed, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in weeks. "I feel free. For the first time in my life, I feel completely free." They celebrated with lunch at a small diner. Margaret ordered pie, something she had always considered an indulgence, but now tasted like victory. Between bites, they planned her next steps, which belongings to keep, which to leave behind, how to stage her departure so David would never see it coming until it was too late. As she drove home that evening, Margaret looked at the house she had once thought she would die in. It stood solid, familiar, but it no longer held her hostage. She had made her choice. And that choice whispered a truth she wanted every woman her age to hear. Life does not end at 70. Independence is not a relic of youth. You can still start over, still carve out a new path, still choose yourself. Margaret parked the car, walked to her front door, and paused with her hand on the knob. She smiled, a small, secret smile. David thought he had trapped her, but Margaret Williams was already 3 steps ahead. Saturday dawned bright, the kind of crisp Illinois morning that usually brought Margaret joy. The air was cool, the sky clear, the scent of damp grass rising from the lawns along her street in Springfield. But that morning carried a tension that knotted in her stomach. She had been awake since 5, moving quietly through her routine, brewing coffee she barely sipped, straightening the curtains, touching each surface of the home she had built and protected for 35 years. She knew what was coming. By 9 o'clock, the rumble of a large moving truck broke the neighborhood calm. Its tires crunched against the driveway Margaret had shoveled in countless winters. Behind it, Linda's sedan rolled up, with the children pressed to the windows, excitement in their faces. Another car arrived, carrying David's cousins, ready to help. Margaret stood at the front door, spine straight, a quiet storm inside her. Through the glass, she saw David step out of the truck, clipboard in hand, directing the movers like a man already in control. He didn't look toward the house at first. He was too busy assigning orders, pointing toward her sewing room, her living room, her sanctuary, as if they were already his spaces to divide. Finally, he approached the porch with a triumphant grin. "Mom, we're here. Let's get started. Movers, start unloading." Margaret opened the door just wide enough to stand in the frame. Her voice was calm but unyielding. "No one steps inside. This is my house." The movers froze, boxes balanced in their arms. David blinked as if he hadn't heard correctly. "Mom, don't start. We've got the truck, the family's here. We talked about this." "No," Margaret said, firmer. "You talked. You decided. I never agreed." The street fell into a strange silence. Neighbors emerged, curiosity pulling them out. Mrs. Jenkins watered her flowers with exaggerated slowness, clearly listening. Mr. Crawford leaned on his fence, eyes sharp with interest. Margaret felt every gaze on her, but instead of shame, she felt power. For the first time in years, she wasn't shrinking to keep peace. She was expanding to take space that was already hers. David's face turned red. "Don't make a scene in front of everyone. Let's go inside and talk." "There is nothing to talk about," Margaret replied. "You are not moving in." Linda approached, carrying a box of kitchen items, her voice laced with pleading sweetness. "Mom, please, the children are excited. Chloe already picked her room. We'll make it easy on you. You won't even notice we're here." Margaret's heart squeezed at the mention of her grandchildren, but she didn't falter. She looked at them with softness, then back at Linda with steel. "I notice when my life is taken from me. This is my home, not your solution." Gasps rippled through the relatives standing by the cars. The movers shifted awkwardly, one older man lowering his box to the ground. "Ma'am, if this is your house and you say no, we can't unload." "Exactly," Margaret said, turning her eyes back to David. "You've treated me as if I'm already gone, as if I'm just an obstacle. But I'm not gone. I'm here, and I say no." The tension peaked. David stepped closer, his voice low but venomous. "You're embarrassing me. You're being selfish. After everything I've done." Margaret's voice cut through his words like glass. "Selfish." "Protecting the house I worked for 40 years to own is not selfish. Selfish is treating your mother's home as your safety net because you cannot provide for yourself." The words hung heavy, echoing off the quiet street. For the first time, David's tongue failed him. His jaw worked, but no words came. The neighbors watched, the cousins stared. Even Linda looked shaken, the box trembling slightly in her arms. Margaret didn't raise her voice, but the authority in her tone was undeniable. "This house is not yours. It was never yours. And today, you will not cross this threshold." For a long, charged moment, no one moved. Then the movers, unsure but respectful, began shifting back toward the truck. One muttered, "Sorry, ma'am. We can't unload against the owner's wishes." David spun around, anger exploding in his gestures, but the plan was unraveling. Relatives exchanged glances, whispers spreading. The neighbors continued to watch, silent witnesses to Margaret's stand. She stood taller than she had in years. One woman, 71 years old, against an entire family's assumption, and she had stopped them cold. Her hand trembled slightly on the doorknob, but her eyes didn't waver. She felt the weight of decades lifting off her shoulders. For the first time, she was not apologizing for wanting to live in peace. For the first time, she was truly defending herself. She looked at David one last time. "Take your truck and leave. This plan ends here." And as they began reluctantly retreating, Margaret closed the door with quiet finality. Her heart pounded, her knees felt weak, but inside her chest something burned steady and strong. A woman who had once believed she had no choice had just made the most powerful choice of all. If you were in Margaret's place, would you have the courage to say no? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice might help someone realize they are not powerless. By Sunday afternoon, Springfield no longer felt quiet. Margaret's phone had not stopped buzzing since the scene on her front porch. Missed calls, voicemails, text messages, the same words recycled in different voices. Talk to him, give him a chance, think of the children. The pressure was relentless, and though she tried to enjoy her morning tea, each ring seemed to echo the centuries-old chorus of expectations that had been stitched into women like her since birth. The first knock came mid-morning. It was her younger sister, Evelyn, who had driven in from Peoria. She stood on the doorstep with her arms crossed, eyes tired. "Margaret, what on earth has gotten into you? David told me everything. He says you humiliated him in front of the whole neighborhood." Margaret stepped aside but didn't invite her in. "Evelyn, I only told the truth. He tried to take over my house without asking." Evelyn shook her head. "He's your son. Sons make mistakes, but mothers forgive. Don't you remember when we were little and Mom let us stay even when we messed up? That's what family does." Margaret's jaw tightened. Forgiving is not the same as surrendering your life. The words hung in the air, sharp and foreign even to Evelyn, who muttered something about pride and stormed off. That evening, the second visitor arrived. It was John Whitmore, David's godfather, a 60-year-old man who carried himself with the certainty of someone used to being listened to. He removed his hat respectfully when she opened the door. "Margaret," he began, lowering his voice as if he were entering a negotiation, "I heard about the incident yesterday. I think there's been a misunderstanding. David and his family are desperate. You don't want to see your grandchildren without a roof over their heads, do you?" She invited him into the sitting room, but she sat tall in her armchair, not offering tea. "John, there is no misunderstanding. My son made decisions for me without asking, and now he wants me to pay for them." John leaned forward, his tone sliding into persuasion. "Look, you're 71. Living alone isn't easy. One fall, one accident, and no one would know. Having them here is protection, companionship. Think of Olivia too, Linda's mother. She's frail. You're stronger than her, and she needs care." Margaret felt her pulse quicken, but she didn't flinch. Care is not the same as invasion. Compassion is not the same as confiscation. I will not trade my dignity for their convenience. John frowned. "You sound bitter. Is this really the legacy you want to leave, pushing family away?" Margaret's voice was steady, almost quiet, but it carried a force that made him shift uncomfortably. "Care doesn't mean taking what is not yours. Respect means asking, not assuming. What I need is not pity, John. What I need is respect." Later that night, her sister's call returned, joined by others' cousins, an aunt in Wisconsin, even an old church acquaintance who had heard rumors. The pattern was the same. Appeals to sacrifice, reminders of tradition, guilt packaged as duty. "Think of the children," one relative pleaded. "Don't you want someone close in case you fall sick?" Another urged. "A good mother never turns her back," whispered her sister again. Each phrase pressed against Margaret like a weight meant to bend her spine. But something inside her had shifted after the confrontation on Saturday. Instead of shrinking, she felt herself standing taller with every demand. Finally, when Evelyn called yet again, Margaret spoke with a clarity that startled even herself. "Evelyn, you say mothers should give everything. Well, I already did. I gave my youth, my strength, my earnings. But respect is not something I should beg for at 71. Respect is something I have earned. Taking my house without asking is not care, it is theft dressed as family duty." There was silence on the line. The silence of someone realizing, perhaps for the first time, that the rules they lived by were not laws of nature. The next morning, Margaret walked to the window as the sun spilled across the lawns. Neighbors waved politely, though she could see curiosity in their eyes. She knew whispers had already spread through Springfield. She turned her son away. She's stubborn, she's selfish. But instead of shame, Margaret felt fire in her chest. She whispered to her reflection in the glass, "I am not selfish for wanting peace. I am not cruel for demanding respect." It was a line drawn in bold ink across her life. That afternoon, Helen stopped by with groceries and found Margaret sitting at the table, more composed than she had ever seen her. "They'll keep trying," Helen warned. Margaret smiled faintly. "Let them. Yesterday they thought I was weak. Today they know I'm not." Climax. Margaret's words to John and Evelyn had spread like wildfire among relatives. For some, they were shocking, even offensive, a mother openly refusing to surrender to family obligation. For others, they landed like ice water on a fevered forehead, forcing them to reconsider what duty truly meant. Social message. In one sentence, Margaret shattered the stereotype that had bound her for decades. Care does not mean possession. Respect is not pity. It was a defiance against the quiet chains placed on the elderly, especially women, who were told their worth was in being useful, never in being free. If you have ever seen an older parent pressured to give up their independence in the name of care, write, agree in the comments. Your voice may remind someone that they are not alone. The papers felt heavier than they looked. A stack of contracts neatly clipped together, each page marked with small flags where her signature was required. Margaret sat in the office of Mr. Patterson, the real estate agent, and steadied her hand on the pen. Through the wide window, she could see a sliver of Springfield's skyline, ordinary and familiar, but for her, it shimmered with the possibility of change. "Take your time," Mr. Patterson said gently. Margaret nodded, though her decision had already been made long before she arrived. She thought of her 3 decades as a librarian, of the modest paychecks carefully folded into savings envelopes, of the mortgage she had chipped away at month by month. For 35 years, this house had been her fortress, her identity. And yet, it had also become a battleground. Her pen touched the page. Margaret Williams. One signature, then another. With each stroke, she felt the past loosening its grip. When the final document was signed, Mr. Patterson smiled. "Congratulations, Mrs. Williams. The sale is official." And he slid a small envelope across the desk. "Here are the keys to your new place." Margaret picked them up, the cool metal pressing into her palm. They were lighter than the house keys she had carried for decades, yet in them she felt the weight of freedom. The new condo was smaller, tucked into a quiet complex near Lake Michigan. It had only 2 bedrooms, a compact kitchen with gleaming countertops, and a balcony that overlooked the water. Modern, manageable, private, exactly what she wanted. As she turned the key in the lock for the first time, Margaret felt like she was stepping not just into an apartment, but into a life she had chosen entirely for herself. She placed her box of essentials on the floor and stood in the doorway, listening to the silence. Unlike the silence of her old house heavy with tension, broken by the echo of David's demands, this silence was light, peaceful, expectant. But the victory was not without confrontation. David arrived 2 days later, face pale and voice hoarse, standing in the driveway of the house that was no longer theirs. Margaret was collecting the last of her belongings when she saw him approach, his steps unsteady. "Mom," he blurted, his voice rising. "Tell me it isn't true. Tell me you didn't sell the house." Margaret straightened, her keys jingling in her hand. "It's true, David. The house is no longer ours. It was mine, and I chose to let it go." His mouth fell open. His hands shook. You sold my inheritance?" The word pierced her, not because of its cruelty, but because it revealed what she had suspected all along. "Your inheritance?" she repeated softly. "That house was never yours. I worked for it, I paid for it, I lived for it, and I decided its future." David's face crumpled. He sank onto the curb like a child scolded for the first time, his eyes wet. "You don't understand," he muttered. "I counted on it. I thought, when you were gone, It would be mine. That was the plan. Margaret's heart ached not for the loss of the house, but for the son she had raised to measure love in bricks and deeds instead of kindness and respect. She knelt beside him, her voice steady but tender. "David, the most valuable thing I could ever give you wasn't that house. It was your education, your values, the lessons I tried to teach you about integrity and hard work. If you see only the walls and roof, then you've missed the real inheritance entirely." For a moment, David wept openly, shoulders shaking. But Margaret didn't reach out to comfort him the way she once would have. She let him sit in the truth, raw and undeniable. He hadn't wanted her well-being, he had wanted security, money, a shortcut. When he finally looked at her, his face was streaked with tears and anger. "So what now? You just leave me with nothing?" Margaret rose, standing tall above him. "I leave you with what I always have, the chance to be better, to grow, to stand on your own. But the house, David, that was never your crutch to lean on." She turned, her steps slow but firm, and walked away. The movers were loading the last box into Helen's car. Margaret didn't look back. That evening, she sat on the balcony of her new condo, the lake stretching out before her, catching the light of the setting sun. She felt no regret, only release. Her life had narrowed in space, but widened in possibility. She lifted her cup of tea, whispering to herself, "The most precious legacy isn't property, it is dignity, it is love, it is teaching your children to live with respect." And in that quiet moment, Margaret Williams began her true final chapter, not as someone's mother to be used, but as a woman who had reclaimed herself. Too many families measure love in property lines and wills. But the greatest inheritance parents give is not a house, it is the strength of character, the education, and the values they leave behind. Margaret's new life unfolded gently, like the steady bloom of spring after a long, harsh winter. The condo near Lake Michigan became more than a shelter. It was a canvas upon which she could paint the life she had once thought lost to her. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she joined a painting class at the community center. At first, her brushstrokes were hesitant, shaky, as if she still needed permission to take up space on the canvas. But soon, bold colors began to flow, deep blues, fiery reds, soft green scenes from her memories and visions of the future she was finally daring to imagine. She opened an Instagram account, guided by her granddaughter's earlier lessons, and began posting her paintings, her garden on the balcony, and the occasional selfie with Helen, who teased her about being more social media active than the grandkids. To Margaret's surprise, strangers left comments of encouragement. A woman in Ohio messaged, "I'm 73 and just started watercolor painting because of you." For the first time, Margaret realized her choices were inspiring others far beyond her own neighborhood. She also grew close with her new neighbors. Chloe, a widow of 72 who taught knitting, often invited her over for tea. Olivia, 68, shared fresh loaves of homemade bread. The three of them, along with Helen, created a small circle of women who laughed loudly, shared secrets, and reminded each other that life at their age could still be full of beginnings. Months passed. One autumn afternoon, Margaret returned from her painting class to find David waiting outside her condo. His shoulders sagged, his eyes tired. He looked smaller somehow, as though the weight of his own mistakes had been pressing him down. "Mom," he said quietly, almost timidly, "I came to apologize." Margaret stood still, keys in hand. "For what, David?" He swallowed hard. "For everything. For deciding without asking you. For treating your house like it was mine. For never once asking what you wanted." His voice cracked. "I thought I was protecting you, but I see now I was only protecting myself." Margaret's chest tightened, but she remained steady. She unlocked the door and gestured for him to sit. Inside, the condo glowed with warm afternoon light, her paintings lining the walls, a gallery of her rebirth. "David," she said slowly, "I am not interested in apologies that fade after a week. What I need is change. From now on, our relationship will be built on respect. Do you understand?" He nodded, his face pale. "Your children may visit me whenever you wish," she continued. but they will come as beloved guests, not as a responsibility I'm forced to carry. If you want me in your life, you will treat me as a woman with dignity, not as an endless resource." David's eyes glistened. "I understand, Mom. I don't want to lose you. I'll try to do better." For the first time, Margaret believed he might. That night, after David left, she stood before the mirror in her bedroom. The woman reflected back was not the one who had once trembled under her son's demands. She was not the weary widow clinging to a house as proof of her worth. In the mirror, she saw Margaret Williams, 71 years old, free and radiant. Not merely a mother, not merely a caretaker, but a woman who had reclaimed the right to say yes and no on her own terms. She touched the edge of the mirror, whispering to herself, "I am no longer the woman who was used. I am the woman who is free." And in that reflection, she found peace. If you believe that older adults deserve respect and the freedom to decide their own lives, hit subscribe and join us in sharing this message. Together, we can make sure stories like Margaret's are heard, honored, and never forgotten. Life does not always unfold the way we imagine it will. For Margaret, the house she had built with sacrifice and love became the very place where her strength was tested. Yet, instead of surrendering to fear, guilt, or manipulation, she chose courage. She showed us that even at 71, it is possible to draw boundaries, to rebuild, and to rediscover freedom. Her journey reminds us of a truth that often goes unspoken. Aging does not erase dignity, and love is never about possession. What we leave behind for our children is not only property or inheritance, it is the lessons of resilience, the values of respect, and the proof that self-worth cannot be measured in square footage. Now, I turn to you. Perhaps you have lived through something similar. Perhaps you've watched your parents, grandparents, or neighbors pressured into giving more than they should. Maybe you carry your own story of strength, or maybe you are still searching for the courage to say no. Whatever your path, your voice matters. Share your experience in the comments below, because when we tell our stories, we remind others that they are not alone. Press the like button if Margaret's courage touched your heart, and share this video with someone who may need encouragement today. Most importantly, subscribe to Grandma's Final Chapter so you'll be among the first to hear the next story. Every week, we bring you voices of women and men who prove that it is never too late to reclaim your life, to find joy, and to live with pride. This is not just a channel. It is a community, a place where respect for older generations is not just spoken, it is celebrated. By joining us, you are helping to spread a message the world desperately needs, that our elders are not invisible, not fragile ornaments of the past, but living, breathing testaments to courage. So stay with us, tell your story, and let's walk together into each new chapter, stronger, freer, and never alone.